So my guest today is Professor David Schindler. David is an associate professor of economics at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. And I appreciate him taking the time to cross some interdisciplinary boundaries and speak to me, a humble psychologist, today on his work for the paper that we reviewed called Shocking Racial Attitudes, which is all about the association between historically the number of Black troops positioned in a place during World War II and the effects of that years later in terms of attitudes and prejudices. So before we really delve into some of the specifics of the paper, I just wanted to ask you, David, how did you first get interested in this topic?
So that's a great question. Thanks for having me, by the way. My co-author and I, we were both graduate students at the beautiful University of Munich, and my co-author had his research idea for his second year paper due, and it was the Sunday, and he needed to present this idea on the Monday, and he said, "I don't have anything. Do you want to meet me in one of Munich's beautiful beer gardens and discuss and see what we can come up with?" And he had prepared this notepad with all of these historical natural experiments, if you will, like things that were particularly special about some historical episode, because he's an economic historian. And he said, what can we make out of those ideas? And at some point he mentioned, I read that the US Army was entirely segregated during World War II. And can we make something out of that? And then so we started discussing what interesting thing we could make from that. And then we were like, hey, at some point, hey, this is really great. We could say something about how prejudicial attitudes may have changed in Britain. And only after that, we figured out that really these African Americans who came to the United Kingdom during World War II were among the really first Black people that the British would have ever seen.
Yeah, it's really interesting and impressive use of historical and more modern data that you kind of weave together. And we're going to return onto this question a little bit later. But if I can get you to speculate a little bit, you do a nice job of, invoking Gordon Allport, psychologist, to talk about, well, what were some of the conditions that were present when these troops were stationed in the UK that allowed for maybe positive attitude change. So I know that it's hard to prove this, but what do you think was present in these types of interactions that allowed for prejudice to possibly be changed?
That's a great question. So I think the fact that there was mostly an overall friendly atmosphere and interaction, right? Like these American troops, they came as friends, helping in the joint cause, and I think that is very different to what we see when we talk about other circumstances where we see migrants coming to other countries, like refugees, for example, who then also compete on the labor market, which clearly wasn't the case here. And so there's like within economics, there's some mixed evidence on like what the effect is of inflow of migrants or refugees on political outcomes. And I think part of the reason this evidence is mixed could just be primarily the circumstances. And I think this is kind of like the most perfect circumstances, if you will, having a common enemy, having a common goal to fight for. And I think that certainly helped.
Right. And then support for authorities is another one that we can talk about in this class, right? And very clearly that these were American troops from both the American government and the UK government were approved and welcomed there. So I think that's another reason why it might have had a positive effects. You say in the paper, though, that there was equal status. And when I was running through the checklist, Allport's checklist in my mind, I didn't necessarily think that there would be equal status between troops and civilians. But is there a reason why you thought that there might be equal status between those two groups of people?
I think the status may just derive from two sources. I think, first of all, I would think of status in the way that Black troops were treated in the US at the time with Jim Crow era laws, and all of these are not present in the UK at the time. And certainly while there are certain sets of stereotypes and prejudicial attitudes certainly common towards Black people, I think it's much less than what you would have seen at the same time in the US South. So that kind of like, I think, gives a perceived status to the Black troops that is much higher. And then second of all, I think also the fact that all of these troops were kind of like united again by their common goal, right? Like there was no preference given in terms of like societal importance of an American unit over a British unit. And so I think that would also help for equal status. I think there's but also I think there's certainly some differences that were at play. I would think that the American troops, like I saw like a guidebook on how to behave for American troops going to the UK, and they said, oh, don't brag about how much money you make, what kind of products you can buy in the US, because the UK at the time seemed to be considerably poorer than the US. And so I think there's certainly some differences with respect to that. And also in the paper, we have this quote that there seems to have been some sort of dislike, or at least a bit of dislike towards white American soldiers because of the way they would behave, which I think some British perceived as condescending, and that they didn't see in Black Americans.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, that helps contextualize this claim about equal status a lot. So, your paper is very impressive, and when there are these really thorough papers, I find that they end up generating a lot more questions. So I'm going to ask you to speculate about a couple of things that I acknowledge that you don't necessarily have firm answers to, but you're the expert here, so I want your take on a couple of things. One thing that I was really interested by was some of the outcomes that you used. And so you had one outcome, which was identification with a far-right party that had some very clearly prejudicial and racist views. And this is more modern day identification with that party. And so when you're choosing your political party, we would call that in the context of this class, like a pretty explicit or conscious decision. But you also show similar effects in terms of the association of historically of Black troops in an area with lower prejudice. You're seeing it also on the IAT as well. So not only are they less biased implicitly, but they're also less biased in what I would think is a very conscious decision of identification with the political party. So we've taken some time in this class to kind of tangle those two apart, explicit and implicit, but you're seeing similar effects at both levels. So can I get you to speculate about why you think that there's an association for these two very different types of outcomes?
So this is of course pure speculation, as you said, but I think the fact that they moved together implies that they, at least to some extent in this setting, capture parts of the same phenomenon. And so I don't specifically know what it takes to make people less implicitly prejudicial, but not explicit, or vice versa.
Don't worry, I'll cover it later in the semester. Don't worry about it.
But I would assume that in this setting, how I envision this would have happened is that the people who interact with the troops, they change at least their explicit attitudes because they learn new information about people they had prejudicial attitudes about, and then maybe that also changes the implicit attitudes. I don't know. It's too far in the past that I can't really tell.
Yeah.
But what I would assume is these people change their attitudes, and then they pass that on to their kids. And I would imagine that implicit attitudes could be affected by what you learn from your parents, and that from that second generation on, so to speak, there is a lower level of implicit and explicit prejudice.
Right. So that actually leads into my next question, my pure speculation question, because you talk a lot in the paper about this idea of intergenerational transmission. So obviously, the people that you're surveying nowadays, more recently, many of those people are not alive. Those who actually interacted with the African American troops in the 1940s. Some of them still are, but they're not going to make up the bulk of your sample by any means. But you're still seeing these effects so many decades later. And so there has to be some mechanism that this thing carries over time. One of them that you pointed out is probably what you learned from your parents. But are there other ways, maybe other subtler ways, that you think that this intergenerational transmission can occur?
Yeah, so I think parents to children is one of them. And then there's another one that I think works through the neighborhood. And then there's some more recent work that looks at refugee integration in France, showing that part of why we see when there's an inflow of refugees, why people become less prejudiced, is because there's changes in the internal migration patterns of those who are prejudiced, and not of the sort that the ones who are prejudiced, more prejudiced, move out of the less prejudiced areas, but rather that people who are more prejudiced don't even move into the prejudiced areas that they would have otherwise done. And I think this is also part of it, that there's some sort of geographic sorting that let's say the African American troops arrive in one location, it makes the local population less prejudiced, and of course they pass it on to their kids. But then also overall, at some point, people might get an idea about this place being less prejudiced, and if you're really prejudiced yourself, you might refrain from moving there in the long run.
Oh, I see. So it kind of establishes a reputation for a neighborhood, and that over
Precisely.
time can bring in people
Precisely.
from who are already predisposed to be low in prejudice.
But I don't think this is really going on to a great extent in our paper, because we looked at the ethnic composition according to a more recent UK census,
Mm.
and we don't see a lot of predictive power of the initial placement of troops. So it doesn't seem to be surviving to this day, because that's what I would imagine. If everybody knows that an area is less prejudiced, that also
Right. Okay.
will be more likely to move into this place,
Okay.
and that we don't see.
Another way to lead into my next question is, when you were originally studying these effects in the 1940s, just everyday life was so different then, and that there was a lot more opportunity for actual authentic interpersonal contact, I would say, maybe relative to what we are doing today, like when we're having this conversation over Zoom. And so I wonder, maybe these effects exist today, but they're weaker because of just the more globalized world where we live in, where people are less dependent on those people around them for these types of interactions. So again, can I get you to speculate? Like, do you think that these types of effects could exist as strongly nowadays?
Yeah, I think these effects do exist. I think it's just harder to establish them with empirical analysis, because we have so many layers of interactions that are going on at the same time, right? Like, so in the paper, we conclude with a sentence saying, okay, everything that we've established now is, in terms of like changing racial preferences, is on top of what people would be aware of through nationwide TV coverage, radio coverage. And of course, today with the internet, with everybody being connected to everyone, that of course changes. I think it's much harder to measure these things, and that's why it's so great that we can use the past, where we can get a more cleaner look at the effects. But I still think these effects are there today. They are just probably spread out over many more different channels.
Right. Okay. So it'll take maybe other types of refined analyses in the future to look at, who's making up people's social network, both in person and online, and other similar effects for both of those, to see what you were studying historically. Before I let you go, I wanted to ask you more broadly about your approach to studying these issues as an economist. So in class, we do talk about the value of archival research, and there are many values of that, specifically for real world application. And then when I have to be pushed further than that, I don't really have a lot to say. I don't do a lot of archival research. I'm much more in the let's generate an experiment and test it world. And so looking over this paper, it's so impressive, all the sources that you pull from in terms of making this archival argument. And so for students out there who are really drawn to this type of archival research, can I get you just to tell us broadly about, the approach that you take for handling this type of stuff, and any advice that you have?
Yeah, so first advice is to read a lot. So especially with this historical stuff, I've learned a lot about reading books from historians on specific topics. And there's lots of books on these issues, like Black troops in Europe. That's a huge topic among some historians. So there's lots of books that you can read. And then I think the kind of like the practical approach is, if you think there's some data that could help you, then search for it on the catalogs of the archives. The National Archives in DC, they have they are really great. They have almost everything. So the United States are really good at keeping records. So I've used that quite sometimes now. And the catalogs on the websites give you a great idea of what's available and what isn't, and more is digitized these days. And then eventually, quite often, it means just go there and collect tons and tons of documents.
Okay, well, I'm learning something too. I did not even know that existed. I'm a little embarrassed to admit that, but I will find the link that you're talking about, and I'll share it in our lecture slides as well. Because, completing this type of work just takes pulling in from so many different resources, and to really tighten your argument is the type of work I really admire, and I'm in no rush to do myself, but I'm happy to read about all the hard work that you're putting on it. You said that this took 8 years to complete, started in 2013, published in 2021?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Just kind of one other brief window into what really takes to put these archival analyses together. So thank you for that persistence, and thank you for talking with me today, David. I really appreciate it. And thanks for your time.
Thanks.